Hello everyone, today we talk about Andalusian horsemen between the 8th and the 11th century for our medieval historical unit series. So we're talking about the Caliphal, the first Emerald and Caliphal forces that, as we know, included a large amount of Christian Spanish cavalrymen next to the Islamic and in this sense also pretty varied, as we will see now, type that is also barely distinguishable on average, especially when we look at the medium lighter cavalry. Like for heavier equipment, we do at least get a better documentation of the differences, because that's simply a more structural panoply that can reveal that. But if we were to look at a regular Rinete, we would have significant difficulties in distinguishing who's who, and this is actually true for the heaviest cavalry as well, certain circumstances. So as you have understood from the episodes about this historical unit series, it's always a matter of, say, drawing an average, right, and accepting, of course, all what we cannot know precisely, but from the various information, various hints we have depicting a stereotypical sort of cavalryman. Today, by the way, we will concentrate on, say, what you could call it like a medium Andalusian cavalryman, and then we will make rapid excursus on the heaviest type that in this context cannot really be distinguished from the broader sort of Arab type of heavy cavalry by equipment. And even there we see that there is a massive Persian influence in arms and armor, also in the very Spain. At this point, the caliphate is attacked also by the Vikings, so you could see a northern European sword even here wielded by a guy that otherwise fought in some local Spanish fashion, but with even some Berber influences. It was also from other areas of Christian Europe, and so that's the fun about this all. So I never made a video about the Andalusian armies, organization, tactics, etc. I made back in the day a video about the Andalusian heavy infantrymen, which is instructive because it tells partly some of the same, it's, say, the mounted equivalent of at least the heaviest types we will describe today. And I have to re-upload it technically because of the pictures issue I had a couple of years ago, but say the audio content is actually the one that matters the most. All right, so the Christian Spanish cavalry was even favored by the Andalusian rulers at this point, right, as they were quite high in demand as mercenaries. The reason being a bit the one that would make the Reconquista crumble the same typhus, the same Islamic system of Spain. We have made really lots of videos at this point about Reconquista warfare and the northern Christian principalities, how they developed, what were they in a broader sense. We have to make really a lot about Islamic Spain to understand even there that, of course, many troops were Christian, the Mozarabs. It's a bit like the opposite later with the Mudeyyars that we made a video on, by the way, after the Christian conquest, as far as the Islamic and Jewish, very large majorities, by the way, were concerned, and keeping on serving, in fact, in the Christian armies, because, as you know, the Reconquista didn't really end in 1492, meaning that it had already ended at the beginning of the 13th century, right? While it is true that the Nasrids held out Granada till that point, technically these Muslim states had declared themselves to be vassals of the Christian monarchs of the Iberian Peninsula. After Las Navas, fundamentally, that's, as you know, the main, it's the watershed, right, in the entire history. But let's say you have, as the most warlike, and in some cases even primitive, northerners compared to the much more florid southern Iberian Peninsula, this sense of, in fact, brutality, of effectiveness, and this sort of way of war that was structuring itself, even as a business, in fact, through the specialization in the raids from the north to the south. This could be, from one side, literally aimed at loot, right, and tribute, but when you realize that these forces served as mercenaries, you realize that it's a bit like the same, right? There was obviously a moment in which the Muslims had the upper hand in the trade balance. They attracted dramatically all these forces from the Christian north because of the large amount of precious metal that they stored. So things changed dramatically, even the distribution of that wealth within the Taifas, when the caliphate had the, say, internal coherence to put an end to itself, right? That's how it technically happened. And I made a video, multiple videos about the caliphate of Cordoba, and basically they realized that they hadn't that sort of celestial favor anymore, and so they literally declared it ended. So there is continuously a lot of back and forth of troops from both sides serving, in fact, in each other's armies. And that's also the reason why it doesn't make even too much sense to try to distinguish them. Always bearing in mind that aside from the sort of clash of culture idea of, say, the Christian north, the Europeans, and sort of the south, the Islamic Arabs, actually we're looking at the Iberian Peninsula as a thing on its own. In its vastity and internal differences that are importantly pronounced, but that make of this system a sort of cosmos within, say, the broader cosmos itself. And we have already noticed how Iberian warfare has, generally speaking, very peculiar characteristics compared to the rest of Western Europe, that here we can denominate as Western, if you want, in the non-geographical but cultural sense of Frankish warfare, that basically was influencing very much the northern Iberians, that while having these, of course, local character, say, unique features by some degree, were, of course, gradually consolidating their military through that Western influence. And this is true also for the Islamic South, as, of course, there were important contacts with the Frankish world as well, not just in trade, culture, etc., but in the same, in fact, mercenaries that came even not just from within the same Spain, but from elsewhere too, right? So there are lots of different sources from the time, some ivories that I could find, in part you see here during the video, that are, say, employable for commercial purpose as pictures, mostly from the Wikimedia credit commons, and that show you like a pretty obvious picture of of course, the basics of this of an average Iberian horseman of, say, between the 8th and the 11th century. There's not much to dramatically characterize these guys. Their tactical role was pretty much the one that, say, cavalry in Spain had always had, right? It's interesting to observe how, for example, the fighting a la Jineta is something that you can trace back. It's not exclusive to the Reconquista, but in a specific Iberian way, if you look back to the Cantabrian gallop and, say, the general sort of equestrian military culture that had existed, especially in the north of the peninsula, but not only, is a millennia-old thing. And you can find, especially from these ivory caskets, lots of, mostly dating to the later period, admittedly, so in a time in which you get towards that feudalization, the same end of the caliphate, and so the fragmentation in the Taifas. And so something different from the very conquest, is the very Islamic conquest of Spain, albeit in fact not that particularly distant. It was just 300 years, and so while a lot does change, there is also, especially in the most common type of horsemen, a lot really remaining the same. Right. In fact, when you look at early 11th or 10th century sources, they show practically the identical dress, and this was also normally very light, just a normal one, maybe more functional for mounted combat in this case, or also dismounted, because they consistently did that so interchangeably, and barely any armor, right? There is also an influence stemming from the Visigothic, the Byzantine past, right? For example, the bare head and the page boy haircut, that is the one you find, in fact, I don't know, in Justinian times, or at the Visigothic court, right? And in art and iconography, appear to be fairly characteristic, right? And this survived, of course, also the Islamic times, considering that there were influences from the Romano-Germanic West, again, that essentially had that kind of identity and sort of fashion deeply ingrained. So you would obviously think of an average Andalusian horseman primarily as a lancer, right? Then he would legitimately have a sword, because, you know, if you can't fight and afford to fight on horseback, let's say, the sword is not really the most expensive thing there, and of course a small light shield, right? We could even stop to this, right, if we really wanted to get to the essentials. The name of this shield was known as Daraka, which has a very interesting etymology, because while arriving to the Iberian Peninsula through the Arabo-Berbers, it came, as a lot of Islamic military terms, from the Middle Persian, daritse, meaning, and this is interesting as far as the parallel with the European pavese goes, even though they do not quite mean the same thing, nor they refer to the same structure, right? Panel, pane, window, lid, cover for an opening, little door, right? So in that case of the pavese, there are lots of myths about the pavese. I should make a video about that at some point. In any case, it's not so simple as normally, you know, especially video game, say, war games culture has tried to spread and generalize. There were all sort of different types of this stuff, but the Prelinian terminology is quite effective, like little door, right, with that sort of, you know, perhaps specifically anti-missile function, especially in a place like Iran, but don't think that the Iberian Peninsula was, yes, of course, it was much less missile warfare there, as they were much less exposed to the steppes, but as you know, skirmishers, javelins were really, you know, flying around more consistently than, say, on another Western battlefield, at least quantitatively speaking. And this means a lot, because the fact that this shield is smaller, right, also is connected with the same speed and agility we'll see now of the riders. So don't think in this sense that on a Frankish battlefield there were lighter things flying, right? In absolute terms, less force impressed. But the type of shield here is functional to that more hit and radical al-far, right, type of Arab, say, hit and run tactics. Interestingly enough, this term stems in turn from the Proto-Indo-European dar, which is the same one for door, right? Dar in further, say, in sort of more ancient Persian. So you get an idea where how far things travel. And yes, right, this Persian terminology had reached Spain through through Africa, right? And so making the circle around the Mediterranean, and there is plenty of that. There is a lot of arms and armor types, styles, characteristics that come straight from the Middle East, in Andalusia, even from Central Asia. Right. So remember that the Islamic world at this point was incredibly connected, right, from the Atlantic to Southeast Asia. Daraka is also, and interestingly enough, the same root word for the later distortion adarga, which is the typical, as you know, kidney-shaped shield we've seen also for the Mudayyars, but in general it was an Iberian thing up to the late Middle Ages, and even beyond. That characterized, especially as a small light cavalry shield, most in fact that type of fighting style. And the Darak at this point was the typical equipment of both the Andalusian but also the North African Muslim light cavalrymen at this point. And yes, there was that much of a connection, even though consider this, that while the Berbers had an important equestrian culture, the Iberian one was actually much more developed, right? So this is not, again, a thing that the Arabs, or essentially these Berbers, ruled by Arabized elites, injected into Spain, but it was largely, right, something already existing, and that they essentially influenced just with this particular types of designs, because there were objectively lots of North Africans also from, as you know, later with the Almoravids, the Almohads, that were routinely reinjected in the Iberian Peninsula. So there was actually a very significant impact, right? This was definitely the most sort of Islamic influenced region in Europe, and also ruled one of it, technically. So this way of war was also just normal, because the caliphate was really powerful, and as much as it attracted people from, say, the northern fringe, it did so also from the southern ones, right, of the Atlas and beyond. So there was a great sort of concentration of different influences, as we will see now. The 10th century Arab merchant, geographer, and traveler Ibn Avkal tells us that until at least his times, and the Andalusians that he had seen, given that he had traveled pretty much all across the Mediterranean, often rode with their feet dangling free of the stirrups. Right, so it's not that they didn't even have stirrups in certain cases, but that they would have been, as we will see now, rendered more agile by this kind of riding, right? And interestingly enough, some of this Cordoban ivories sources are, again, extremely precious for our iconographic understanding of these sources do match, right? There is at least some evidence of these horsemen riding without their feet into the stirrups. And the reason for this is, of course, a more agile type of warfare that the stirrup would have somehow hampered, right? In other words, if you have, of course, lighter troops that are less likely to just practice the shock charges based on the thickly packed formation with couche lengths, etc., that is becoming systematic in the Frankish world, even though things were pretty much opened there still at this time, and or throughout this time. You know, you see also in the Bayeux tapestry at the end of our period, essentially, how, you know, many different types of fighting, even for the heavies, always remained, also in warfare in general. And made these guys preferring a more skirmishing sort of maneuvering mode of some sort, right? So a possible explanation for Andalusian cavalry riding without stirrups or with their feet dangling free is that this was a technique for maintaining balance and stability while riding in a less charging, impacting way, right? They needed to move faster with this hit-and-run tactics, and you needed, for this reason, to adjust their position on the horse based on this sort of frenetic movement, right? It's a bit something that we see in all those cultures where there is a lot of individual equestrian prowess, and so you have even evolution stunts on horseback and so on. Here, of course, in combat without exceeding, of course, there were some Andalusian warriors who were pretty much careful about keeping their feet in the stirrups, especially because they did charge as well. And this practice may have generally allowed greater flexibility, mobility on horseback, definitely advantageous for certain military maneuvers. The fascinating thing about this is also, by the way, that the Andalusian horsemen did nevertheless wear spurs, which was a bit different from what was going on in the Eastern Islamic world, where troops, generally speaking, did not use them. Right, they were used, but they were not so strong like in this particular area of the Islamic-dominated world, and this, by the way, would indicate an important influence from northern Spain, and or perhaps just a simple functionalization of this type of warfare there in parallel. Right, it was surely influenced by Western Europe, not only. Right, and here the explanation is subtler, right, and it can have to do with the differences in the types of horses used by the Andalusian and the Eastern Islamic cavalry. Bear in mind, of course, that Spain was using Berber horses, so at least a type of mount that was significantly different from what was used in the Eastern Islamic world, also in the most sort of Persian and Turkic influenced one. Andalusian horses were often bred for speed and agility, with a focus on quick acceleration and maneuverability. So it's not even necessarily about having heavier horses, right? So in order to get the most out of such mounts, riders would have used spurs to encourage them to move forward and respond quickly to commands, as we've seen, for the same reason for which they needed to frenetically change position, so to smoothen all the movements, etc. Of course, you had to be that sort of to the point in the way you address the horse towards a direction or another, right? While Eastern Muslim cavalry, that, as we will see now, was traumatically and impactfully influenced by the unspeakable magnitude of Persian and Turkic warfare, because that's essentially what it was. The Arabs had really poor cavalry at the beginning of their adventure, often used larger, more muscular horses. At least we're talking about the heavier types or heavy cavalry charges. So first of all, of course, this does not apply to, in fact, the average Eastern Islamic horsemen that would be lighter. But again, we are generally and better documented about the heavier, say, cavalrymen, because they were just more represented, obviously, in art, etc., wherever we can get any data about them. And these impressive beasts by size, right, were used for heavy cavalry charges, were more resistant to spurring, so that they may not have required the same level of encouragement or finesse in handling. I made a video about the famous, Nisaean horse, right, the one of the heavenly kind that is a bit the prototype for this ideally. And it was not that these animals were actually capable of less impressive feats, right? But they were at that point usually bred for obeying the knight immediately, just at the voice, at this small movement of the bridles, rather than being spurred. And in any case, the heavier they were in that sense, the more just shock force and in a sort of collective, sort of straight, and just sort of one-shot kind, even though, of course, they could repeat the charges multiple times in certain cases, but these were sort of the reserves that were normally left, especially in the easternmost Islamic armies, in reserve to the last action of the battle, and had to smash an enemy. It was just there, right, and focus on just frontal attack, so not too much maneuvering involved that may have required more spurring. This is just an idea. Consider that spurring could also cause injury to the heavier horses, which may explain why, again, they were not commonly used by the Eastern Islamic riders. But also here we have to understand the measure by which this happened, and even though we guess, say more or less what was the proportion between the two areas, the two regions, we still don't know exactly the absolute proportion of spur employment in the various arms. Then there were surely heavier types of horsemen in Al-Andalus as well, right? And the sense is that, of course, they were better equipped, as always. That's what they were better trained. They were just part of the elite, right? They would have typically worn long or short mail corselets or scale corselets of unspecified length, which could even be apparently worn over the mail. This is something that at this point the Byzantines, for example, were bringing to an extreme with their cataphracts. The Niceforian ones also made a video about them, with even 3 layers of armor, right, but of metal one, plus the even other padded right underneath, but even over them. So the most essentially the heaviest type of cavalry ever, and the Byzantines designed specifically because they had a massive state that could make them afford as essentially the type of horsemen that had to crush literally any sort of resistance they had in front of them. It was not necessarily just an extremely practical idea, but it did work as long as these troops existed. Then, regarding the heaviness of, say, this potential heavy Andalusian horseman, we can, of course, imagine vambraces, greaves. Helmets were usually called baida, means egg, right? Because they were shaped that way, like a skull. And one type, unique, by the way, to Iberian Muslims at that time, was the zaika, which had essentially a male hood like actually some of the heaviest Persian styles back in the day, leaving only the eyes uncovered. So imagine just your entire face covered with mail, also your nape and all, enclosing your face. This was the same type of head protection used by the Sasanian Klibanari just less than a century before the Islamic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, interestingly enough, and again by Arabs, Arabicides, Berbers, etc., that had received an important Persian influence, as we were recalling that before, right? Consider that the same term Klibanarius probably derived from the Persian grifbanvar, which means neck guard wearer, And so stressing also the additional, of course, protection that these, in fact, heavily armored troops, to say the least, wore. Clibanaris, others think, was sort of a omen in the, say, Latinization of the term, of course, from the Persian, for which these guys would have literally cooked within this enormous sort of metal structure, right? But the terminology is more likely referring to this important complement, right, in the panoply of the heaviest type of Persian cavalry type, that at least of late antiquity migration era, because it was technically the Parthians who had the very heaviest level of complete cataphract equipment. The Sasanian horsemen later on didn't have, say, Sasanian cataphracts didn't have the entire horse armored in the posterior half, right? And I will not digress now explaining why that is the case, but of course what you find in Al-Andalus is something remarkably lighter, considering especially again that most of the troops that invaded the Iberian Peninsula at the time were infantrymen, right? The majority of the Islamic troops were Berbers. Some of them were also or still pagan at the time, and most of them were actually infantry, and was lots of that type of troops. It's complex. To digress also on this topic, I will make a video about North African warfare at the time to explain the world picture a bit better. In any case, just to make you understand how similar the military terminology, but also the actual pieces of armor were across different cultures, that the same old Frankish word Halsberg, in fact, from which eventually Hallberg would have derived, means neck protection as well, right? So the need, especially for the heaviest horsemen, to provide themselves with this sort of enveloping defense from the back was pretty much transversal across Europe, Mediterranean, the Middle East, etc. All right. If we are to compare, let's say, sort of here Andalusian horseman and an Arab one, is how much the former would look Visigothic for an important amount of time, right? In a broader Romano-Germanic feature, it is true that also, again, I would like to make enormous excursus about, even in this case, like, and we will make videos on this, the reciprocal influences between Roman and Germanic clothing, especially military clothing, during the migration era. I say this because the south of Spain, that would naturally become the center of the emirate, the caliphate in Cordoba, was one of the single most radically Romanized lands, definitely the most in the Iberian Peninsula. There are a few that can compare in the West proper. So in there, lot of Byzantine influence that, say, at the time of the Arab conquest had been around, because it's at the beginning of the previous century that the Byzantines had actually lost the coastline to that. We were talking the other day in the video about Constans II, actually, how continuous the Roman influence was within the same early Islamic armies as soon as they conquered the Levant, right? So this would have been true later on for the same Iberian Peninsula. But aside from the scarcity of evidence in the for the earliest times, there would have been also a foreign influence on this. And speaking of Avantaeus, by the way, there is an interesting archaeological piece from Jativa in Spain, dating to the 11th century. That is the famous Pila. This was a carved marble basin from a palace. It's preserved again in the Archaeological Museum of Jativa, and it shows interestingly enough, and in this unique, so almost unique relief carving in Islamic Andalusian art, a type of headgear, right, in a combat between horsemen, which could be a segmented or fluted helmet with neck guard or aventail or some form of cap. So again, even here some elaborate protection, which is very similar to an 8th-9th century silk-covered leather cap found in a grave in northern Caucasus. So a crossroad of a hell of military cultures, as we've seen for the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series last spring, where surely there was a lot of Iranian stuff around, plus the Turks fundamentally arriving, plus other, say, influences from Constantinople, from, say, the various syntheses that the Arabs, the Caliphate, have made from the south, right? There is an almost identical headgear, by the way, in two statuettes of guardsmen from the mid-8th century Islamic Umayyad palace at Kirbat al-Mafyar in Palestine, which is particularly fascinating because it shows how similar certain designs were, how scattered, and how, in fact, Spain, in the westernmost of the Islamic world, but also, as we've seen, pretty much so longitudinally across the entire Europe, would receive through the Islamic influence, the Islamic domination. Speaking of Arab heavy cavalrymen of, say, the time of the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, so in the early 8th century, could think of him again as some sort of long scale corselet with leather cloth, a helmet with, in this case, the Persian influence solid neck guard, right? It was known as mikfar at the time. And this type of heavy cavalry for the early Arab armies, as we pointed out before, so for the ones that invaded Spain, was quite rare, right? Consider that in their early warfare, such as at the Battle of Uhud in 625, of the 4,000 Arabs present in the engagement, only 800 had armor, and at least 600 of these were infantry. I made a video years ago about the early Arab tactics, and of course they were notoriously based on infantry, right? At this point, this very early day, the Arabs, yes, they had, mounted forces to raid caravans, skirmishing, etc., but say most of them in Arabia fought on foot just by default. It's this massive Byzantine, Sasanian, and later just Turkic influence that provides them with an ever greater amount of cavalry, right? And just they remained segmented throughout the age of invasions with, with relatively modest, relatively contained cavalry contingents, right? And this depends, of course, on also the forces that were levying, right? But, of course, in the more civilized countries that the Arabs conquered, there were a loss of infantry. They were not nomads. They yes, there was a lot of cavalry around in general, especially during the migration era that, say, the Islamic era still arrives to close, but still within, in a way. And so in the Middle East, technically, with all those ghulams from Central Asia, it's as if the migration era had never stopped, right? Until very late in time, telling the truth. So on average, we can say that a third of the Arab cavalry, at the very most, would have been heavies, right? And this would have been already a huge deal, some of the ultra heaviest type of cavalry available. By the 9th, the 10th century, the Arabs had now much larger amounts of armored cavalry in general, right? And in these various regions that were not, from which they're, say, the caliphate and the various sort of other powers that somehow originated from it were based. And so we can't even technically say, like in the case of the same Al-Andalus, that we're talking about Arabs anymore, right? Those are Spanish fundamentally with some North African influence. There was a type of long mail worn, the Byzantine zaba, which in Arab sounded like zartfa, right? Persian influence would be significant in helmets. We've seen especially the ones with male aventail. You would have, as we've seen with the Andalusian horsemen, also wooden or metal greaves or vambraces of Byzantine design. This would have been commonplace also in the elite of the Visigothic army, right? And remember always Belisarius, horsemen in Italy that found such difficult situation economically with the plague, etc., that had to use, in fact, wooden armor, and there is nothing strange really about that. Of course, there was horn as well, were different types. You find in this sort of 9th, 10th century Arab forces tubular vambraces of Persian design, also in circulation. There are some very interesting ceramic fragments from Medina al-Zahra, preserved in the local museum in Cordoba. These ceramics have pictures on them. Unfortunately, some of these plates are broken, right? But they show what the traditional military style of Al-Andalus and North Africa were, essentially in the late 10th century. That's where we date the ceramics. And interestingly enough, we see a horseman with a male hauberk with long sleeves, and this latter characteristic indicates, likely at least, an influence from the Middle East, or Iran more specifically, because around this time, so in the 10th, but also in the 11th century, you don't find but short-lived male hauberks in Europe, at least as the norm, right? And so while, again, in Spain, it may have been produced by, say, local need rather than influences, because influences here are just in style, we can connect this with the Islamic world, which this region was part, where instead things were more normal along that pattern, right? And interestingly enough, the figure of this horseman shows a moderately large round shield, which seems to be held on the arm, by the way, rather than in the hand. This, by the way, is a heavier type of horseman. It may even have some sort of European, sort of more marked European, heavier face per se, but also this fact of having the shield held with the arm could have mixed influences. With the right, the guy holds likely a spear. On the head we find a round helmet that has perhaps a crest or comb rising from the brow, which is very similar in construction to some helmets seen in 10th and 11th century southern France, that was very much connected with, say, Islamic Spain and, say, the Iberian Peninsula in general, also because they were essentially Visigothic lands still, in some fashion. I just made recently a video about the specific warfare of both northeastern Spain and southeastern France throughout this time, yes, starting from the 11th century. Also very interesting is something that would develop as a specific feature of early 12th century Christian Iberian art that we have also encountered, in fact, in other videos, that is a substantial nozzle, right, as crudely portrayed here, could be understood as the forerunner, in fact, of the later type. So this gives you an idea of how hybrid, already at this point, well, we're in the late 10th century, there is a general decline of the caliphate, let's say the Westerners are getting the upper hand, right? But that's in fact what you would expect, an important mix. We find, of course, also the short-sleeved hauberk types, right, that are common in Al-Andalus anyway, such as the one worn by one of the huntsmen represented in a carved ivory box made in Cuenca and dating from 1026, preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Burgos, but originally part of the treasury of the monastery of Santo Domingo dos Silos, in which you clearly see this. It's not easy to understand, again, on a carved ivory what kind of material these armor is supposed to be. It would be of different material but with the same design, but there's definitely a smaller, like a short-sleeved male hauberk, worn on a sort of striped garment, right? Probably some kind of kilted one that, as we've seen, of course, was frequent to be worn even without mail, right? Because that's pretty obvious, right? It would have been the most common type of armor, and the padded type. We know that each cavalry unit in Al-Andalus had a different standard, and there were different devices representing some, say, legendary animals, of course, provided with quite warlike and universal imperial symbolism, such as the lion, the leopard, the eagle, the dragon. That all of these had different meaning in sort of tradition. The lion is the force and the sort of the local ruler per se. The leopard has interesting Dionysian characteristics. It was in fact originally connected with Bacchus, and it was a pretty aggressive animal. The eagle, of course, is the universal symbol of the empire, also in the Islamic world. The dragon is, of course, the one that you have to slay in order to attain personal transfiguration in holy combat. So, of course, these various units had different zoomorphic, sort of heraldry, right, that they identified with. They were under in some regiments, other units that at some point, in fact, the cordmans maintain even a sort of semi-permanent force. There is yet another carved ivory box made in Cuenca dating to 1049-1050, preserved at the National Archaeological Museum of Madrid, which shows a guy wearing mail beneath an outer tunic, albeit the wavy lines could represent a lion's claw mark pattern. So this is just like an hypothesis, but just for telling you how the symbolism, of course, is all over the place, and it had quite sort of heraldic, proto-heraldic meanings, not differently from, of course, what was happening in Frankish Europe. In some manuscripts, illuminations, we find bows used by horsemen. This is also not so strange, right? We have no idea how many would be equipped like this. Probably not too many, as a matter of fact, because horse archery requires something normally. There were horse archers pretty much everywhere in the West, only the truth that's something that we underestimate dramatically, right? Also later with crossbows, but I'm not talking about the more famed late medieval longbowmen, but just something that had always existed from antiquity and that was still out there in function. For example, about the aforementioned ceramic fragments, we can say that one of these figures shows an archer, even though the image is pretty damaged, right? And this guy has a recurved bow, and the idea is that, again, recurved bow equals essentially the composite type, right? And that rather than thinking at a Turkic influence like the one it could have come to Iberia through the Islamic domination, can easily think that was still a reminiscence, like for example in southern Italy, of some late Roman and Byzantine period composite bows that, as you know, were pretty much out there in the empire, and that surely had a steppes origin ultimately, because at least in the east, in the steppes, it had been used like this, but it was a technology after all, and especially in the south of the Iberian Peninsula, may have remained more frequently than elsewhere, just because of all these exchanges, etc. We also find in the ivory box from Cuenca dating to 1049-50 two figures using bows, one with a regular curve and the other one with a sort of more obvious composite structure, with angled ears, by the way. Also, both of these guys have quivers or arrows in their belts. In the ivory box from the treasury of the monastery of Santo Domingo dos Silos, we find an archer with an angled composite bow, right, which is definitely telling us how frequently present this type of weapon had to be on Iberian battlefields. Plus, there is an object thrust into the belt of this guy that may be distinguished as a bunch of arrows rather than a quiver per se, but again, the picture is self-explanatory, right? This area was substantially influenced still by Byzantine tradition, likely other Islamic injections of composite bows, and so also more dynamic, sort of more ranged kind of horse archery. This is fascinating because eventually that type of bow wouldn't have, say, a future compared to the shock cavalry tactics of the heavily clad, northerners plus the crossbows. But it was still a thing, and this region in Europe maintained much greater continuity also with late Roman traditions in the meanwhile, right? Descriptions of army reviews held in the reign of the second Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba, Al-Hakam, we're talking 961, 976. That the caliphate was established substantially late in time from the emirate, right, and also a bit as a response to the Fatimids, but I made a video about this specifically if you're interested. Well, these reviews record an important amount of black African archers wearing white capes, fascinatingly enough. There was Sub-Saharian cavalry in Spain and North Africa at this point, right? These were mercenaries from Black Africa that were routinely, hired, right, and by the Arabs pretty early on, right? Some were brought to Sicily. Spain was really the place where they were more present, also in substantial numbers, by the way. And the thing went on for centuries, right, until the Almoravids, the Almohads. And this means, of course, that these guys brought with them also part of their tribal warfare, even though it was significantly influenced by Arab military styles, and also one of other places. And this is interesting also because we do have a substantial evidence of North African fighting style. We've seen before the thing of the stirrup that could be used and not used at the same time. from the aforementioned Pila of Sativa, we find some North African, at least looking horsemen, that could represent, if we stretch the dating of the Pila to the late 11th century, because it's normally dated to the early, right? But the former would match perfectly the timing of the Almoravids, the veiled, here represented as veiled Murabitin, that means those from the Ribat, right? So these fortresses that, as you know, I made a video about the, say, the sort of monastic sort of jihad mentality these guys had, and how they prepared themselves to take over the northwestern African coast and seizing power in the decadent Islamic Spain, right? These guys, however, were not black at most. At least they were of Berber Saharian origin fundamentally. So again, yes, they were pretty mixed, but they're different overall from the, of course, the black Africans proper. Even though they reached up to very far south, as they would have subjects of that ethnic background, right? And if this interpretation of the Pila is correct, there would be essentially some bearded elders that representing the sort of quarreling petty rulers of the Muslim Andalusia before the Almoravids arrived in the end of the 11th century. And so again, the Almoravids had a very specific mentality described in other videos, and had contempt towards these guys, as they thought to be the more chosen, warlike, more sort of correctly interpreters of Islamic precepts. It's obvious that the substantial spread of archery that we witnessed here, at least more than what we see in the rest of Western Europe, is an indicator of some sort of lighter type of course of troops proportionally spread in Al-Andalus, which meant, as we've seen, also in general lighter type of armor, right? Which included for the body also leather, felt corselets. In the aforementioned carved ivory box of Cuenca from 1049-50, right? There is an interesting sort of parallel line series trace for the coat of one of these guys, because the others otherwise would wear a plain tunic, right? The neck of which seems to have fallen open, by the way. And considering that the other evidence around for different sources, we can think that such stripe sort of coat could have been padded, right, kilted, but also of mail. Like, we don't have to, we don't know exactly here how the artist was thinking, but it's likely that there were quite commonly, again, these types of lighter armor, organic material employed more often than say the heavier types, even for substantially heavier troops, right, in relation to the local warfare. It might have been also a matter of weather, like thinking some of these areas would be pretty hot, especially during the war season, that extended, of course, in southern Europe, also beyond the normal chronological limits. But say the idea is mostly that if you had that, say, a type of heavier armor, you would, generally speaking, use it in spite of atmospheric conditions. Right here, it seems rather than Cordoba was much less of a feudal state than how the North was molding, and the North was also quite poor materially at this time in comparison. So you don't really find even there an excessive amount of heaviness. Say the Spanish forces at this point are much lighter than the rest of Western Europe. But you also have that more, say, tendentially feudal elite, in which the heavier, say, the true elite, in fact, is much heavier than in numerical proportion than the one you would find in the Islamic South, right? You would see lamellar and breastplates, however, because still the Cordobans had pretty heavy units as well. As we've seen, Sasanian influence was quite strong still at this point, and there was also the aforementioned Byzantine fashion around. For example, the pteruges, right? That would have added some minimal extra protection to the rest of the armor. Would not be surprising, also considering that the same Leo VI, whose Tactica we have read here and there, is a bit as the continuation of the Strategicon, but updated now with the Arabs, that were the new entry among the infinite peoples that would reverse themselves as avalanches repeatedly on Constantinople. That in fact the Arab equipment was pretty much like the one of the Romans, and this is pretty obvious. Right here, the Romans naturally means the Byzantines of the time. So it's obvious. I mean, the Levant, and so a massive chunk of what would become caliphal power, but also North Africa and southern Spain had been practically Roman. I mean, material culture was that one, the fleets were that, people remained also in great numbers, Christians, for example, and what we see, like the Arab world was actually just superficially so from a linguistical point of view as it was coming to be, but of course it was simply the continuation of what had been existing before for centuries and centuries, and these are immediately the ones next to them, right after them, that were just moving on the same basis, and bases that, by the way, had been at this point regrowing from the crisis in a much slower way, so surely transformed from before, but still pretty limited, let's say, within the options that those same cultures provide. Don't get me wrong, they were quite important regional civilizations, but right, this is true again for the Persians as well. Speaking of swords, we didn't talk about them so much, but as I was saying before, there were varieties here. In spite Spain was becoming, say, or continuing, say, to be famous for blades, right, in different times in history. At this point, the so-called Damascene style, right, blades was in fact being grafted of this pre-existent metallurgical tradition locally. The best weapons in Europe were coming from within the Frankish world, right? And aside from trade, traffics, imports, even saying Frankish mercenaries that were hired at the same caliphal court, you would have yet another source, this, say, at least using the same weapons but making them make a different tour. That is the Viking one, right? And we are not sure sometimes, because actually all these swords were pretty similar at the time, even in Spain, of course. So there is one preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Seville, which we can't say whether it was Andalusian or Scandinavian as a consequence. This dates to the 10th century. It's actually present in a fragmentary fashion, and there is a debate, in fact, whether it had actually been carried by an Andalusian warrior, was actually brought by some Norseman who was either killed there, maybe, who knows, even settled down, was hired, right? Sure, the Scandinavians weren't coming with very positive intentions in the first place, but they toured a lot, right? And they did a lot of stuff. They traded. We have seen it in the video about Leon. So they allied with local noblemen, lords, etc. And so there would always be, even later on, think about during the Crusades, this sort of Northern European influence in also in armor, given that were these guys settling in the Iberian Peninsula, that in many ways at different times was just a huge frontier, right? Especially towards the 11th century starting. Then we have another fragmentary sword from, this is Andalusian, right, dating to the 11th century, and preserved at the Army Museum of Madrid. And this is an interesting combination of different elements, right, from different cultures. You have essentially a European form of sword, would be the most common anyway, but the hilt would be sort of more Mediterranean this time, so perhaps Islamic influence in style, rather than in the northern or central European fashion, right? And there were, as you know, differences in blades. We see definitely that the ones from the swords from the continent, from the Frankish world, are more tapering normally because there was more armor around. At least among the heavier cavalrymen, it was a sort of more compact way of war that was specializing also to, in fact, penetrate more effectively the joints of armor, so that tends to be tapering, right? Whereas in the Mediterranean, especially in the southern shores, from the Muslim side, you see still more chopping type of weapons without too much of say with a relatively rounded tip, right? So relatively lighter swords as well in this sense, more apt to this sort of lighter warfare compared to Europe. It was not radically different, but still enough to notice systemically, right? So as we've seen as weapons, swords, lances, but also maces, this were a very elite thing in the Islamic world, carried particularly by ghulams. I made a video about bludgeoning weapons just recently, and there was all sort of symbolism behind that however transcends say cultures. There you have the club, the mace, in fact gradually developing from one into other at this point, also in the West. So again, the Islamic Andalusia is still somehow in between this world. A mace would usually be carried on the right side, tucked beneath the knee, and stirrup strap, at least in the Arab fashion. There were axes sometimes. In the Arab world, but say the Tabajin type of Iranian influence that you can find even in Spain at this point. They were carried suspended from the saddle. And by Islamic standards, you can argue that only elite cavalrymen, such as chieftains of ghulams, wore armor. Right? This is something that is evident also in Cordoba. Right? Standard bearers were armored musicians, because there was, I made a video about Islamic military music, an incredibly important role played by the Nakarakana in the Islamic tradition as far as transcendental divine power was concerned. So musicians had, generally speaking, a greater importance than in the West, but for reasons that may not be so obviously just cultural. There was some functionality regarding the different type of tactics that were employed compared to the West were bulkier, and so they required less sort of articulation, sounds, as much as they were important also there. And we probably overlooked dramatically Western military music at this point as well. There were small bells on the armor of these men-at-arms that were supposed to essentially get in tune with through the wearer exploit with universal cosmic order, so receiving the grace, the Imperium from God during these fights. The Skilitz's manuscript shows Islamic Arab forces wearing similar helmets to their own, but with a turban wrapped around the lower part, right, with some scale or lamellar aventails, and other with small fluttering plume. This may also be just some sort of styles of the artist, of the beautiful illumination of the Skilitzes, but they still could be distinctive. You couldn't find them everywhere, and they may have been there in a way or another also in the Al-Andalus, so that could help characterizing better in some way these forces. And we will really have to talk more about the Andalusian army at this time, because it is really, a thing that we didn't concentrate too much on as a statile army. Consider that the Cordobans had practically, together with the Byzantines, the only true, proper, sort of centralized, bureaucratic state with a permanent military, at least in the Roman Sasanian fashion, at least Sasanian intending Mesopotamian for how the Sasanians had tried to centralize the Iranian plateau, but that's what up to the 11th century, in fact, is maintained. Also in Constantinople, we've seen it with the issues connected with the pronoia system, the attempt of Basil II to maintain sort of farmer, sort of peasant soldiery that had been the backbone of the Byzantine system. Admittedly, they were much more sort of proto-feudal, aristocratic systems than we think, right? We have a bit too much the myth of the idea of a centralized state that didn't quite exist in the way we intend contemporarily for Rome or for the Persian Empire. But it is true that while Latin Germanic Europe was developing on a different basis that would be slower at the beginning, especially during these centuries to grow, still had a much greater gluing factor and managed eventually to create more robust states on the longer run during the Middle Ages than these ones that somehow collapsed also at the hands of the same Westerners. So that's definitely very, very relevant as far as we analyze these military cultures, also to appreciate their capacity, like again compared to one another, function of one another. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.